Welcome to the Sleep Science Podcast. I'm Penny Lewis, a sleep scientist and the presenter of this show. In this program, we talk about all things related to sleep, from dreaming and sleepwalking to what sleep does for the brain and the body, and how we can get more out of our sleep. The Sleep Science Podcast is a production of the NAPS Sleep Lab at Cardiff University. You can find out more information about the guests on the show, the podcast itself, and our sleep research in Cardiff on the podcast webpage. If some of the neuroscientific terms we use sound unfamiliar to you, you can also find extra information about these and definitions in the glossary in the episode description. My guests today are Dr. Anat Arzi, who's a research fellow in the Brain and Spine Institute at ICM Paris, but who's now joining us from Israel, and Dr. Thomas Andrillon, a research fellow at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. They're both prominent figures in the study of consciousness and sleep, and together they hold the distinction of being the first two people to strongly demonstrate that the human brain can actually learn new information while it's asleep. Where did this interest come from, and what did you do to look at this question?
In my PhD, I was working in an olfaction lab, and actually I was taking advantage of the sense of smell to ask questions about processing and learning during sleep. And we're fascinated about the possibility of the sleeping brain to do so much. So we can consolidate information, we can reactivate memories that were previously learned, we can distinguish between our parent voice and a different voice. We can respond to our own name. We can semantically discriminate between objects and animals. We can do so many things in sleep, but is it so that we cannot learn any new information? So we were puzzled by this and said, okay, there is a lot of literature trying to teach sleeping humans new language, for example, and evidence from earlier on and until the 60s and 70s, through using verbal information, they concluded that sleeping humans cannot learn any new verbal information unless arousal had occurred. And we said, so let's go back to the beginning. Let's not do something complicated. Let's find a simple form of learning, first building block, and see if this is possible in sleep. Working in an olfaction lab, this was actually perfect because the sense of smell has unique interaction with consciousness. One thing is that odors, usually they do not wake us up, right? We don't have alarm clocks that spread odors. Although I must say that in Japan, they have this fire alarm that spread the odor of wasabi, because this is trigeminal and this will give us some irritation sensation in the nose, and this will wake us up. But that said, usually odors do not wake us up unless they are just very trigeminal. So this is a wonderful thing if you want to use odors to study sleep. And another thing is in olfaction, we have an implicit measure for processing. And this is the way we modulate our respiration to odors. And we took advantage of these different characteristics to probe associative learning in sleep between tones and odors.
You challenged really not only this idea that we can't learn in sleep, but also this idea that the brain is unresponsive to external stimuli during sleep. That was something that was a bit entrenched in the literature, the older literature. And I wonder how both of you kind of decided to ignore this really and look at what happens if we stimulate during sleep and how the brain reacts and think that we could learn.
In my case, I have to say that this interest was mostly initiated by the researcher who was my PhD supervisor at the time. So even before he became my PhD supervisor, so Sid Quider, who is a man who loves challenges. So he's not a sleep researcher, he's really a consciousness researcher and mostly known for his work in babies, actually. And after showing that babies were conscious at a very early age, he decided to take another challenge. And he saw in sleep a way to put people naturally, without interfering too much with their brain, to put them in states that are a bit different from wakefulness. And the idea was to use more sleep as a mean to manipulate consciousness and see the impact on your ability to process information. and potentially process this unconsciously. But with this initial idea, actually, we dived a bit in the literature, and we discovered that there was already quite a lot of work done on how we can respond, usually by waking up to different type of information, and how the relevance of that information to everyone or to a specific person in particular could modulate the likelihood that we'll wake up. And we were thinking that if people can wake up more easily to a specific sound, maybe that means that even when they are not waking up, they are still processing that information. So we really thought it would be interesting to find ways to assess this processing of information when sleep is being preserved. So we did a couple of studies in this. And once you have shown that they can indeed process what's going on in their surroundings while sleeping, the next logical step is, can they learn about it? Because when we're awake, each time we process an information, someone learns something out of it. It can be explicit, it can be implicit, but virtually every single processing will leave a trace in the brain somewhere. So the question will be, is the same thing happening in sleep? And that's where, again, the literature was very interesting, because you had very contrasted prediction. Some people will say, yes, if you can process, then you should be able to learn. And some other will have said, no, it's the state in which you are in sleep prevents any form of plasticity. So it was, in a way, a good challenge. You had very clear predictions. There are methods that you can use, that you can take from what have been done in awake people. So it was very exciting to dive into this, although it was a bit challenging, methodologically speaking and practically speaking. But there was a challenge that attracted Sid Quidger a lot, and he put me into this. I have to admit that initially I was much more skeptical than he was, but it turned out that sleep as a biological phenomenon was really full of surprises.
So what was it about the physiology of sleep that led some people to say the brain cannot encode information at this time?
There is an area of evidence, both in humans and animals, that will make this prediction. So, for example, the fact that some of the key neuromodulators that we know are promoting plasticity are suppressed during sleep. The fact that there is a sensory isolation in the first place, so information is not even accessible, so it's hard to learn something you can't access. In the dynamic of the information within the brain, there was this experiment showing that you have a reversal. For example, instead of information flowing from the hippocampus to the cortex, you can have this reversal of information that will prevent the establishment of long-term learning. So there are lots of these pieces of evidence that could mean that you won't be able to learn during sleep. But on the other hand, there are also strong evidence showing that there is still plasticity going on in the sleeping brain. Just the fact that we're able to consolidate memories, or even that we're able to manipulate these consolidation processes by the outside, by presenting certain type of information, is a good demonstration that some learning abilities are being preserved. And as it is often the case in science, when you have lots of evidence in favor of two opposite things, they are likely to be both right. And I think it's just that sleep is much more complex than the way we usually present it. We have this tendency to present as monolithic thing, sleep, and that's it. Whereas it's actually a very varied phenomenon with lots of sub-stages and variety and richness. And maybe it's analyzing this variety and diversity within sleep that you can understand why you have these different predictions.
And I can maybe add that some of the evidence that supported the view that humans cannot learn in sleep were studies that were trying to teach sleeping humans answers to questions, for example, so pairs of words, and ask them explicitly later on if they can retrieve this information. And based on these studies, it was concluded that you cannot learn during sleep. And this was the common view for quite a lot of years.
So it feels like there were at least two kinds of competing sets of thinking, right? So one set says, in sleep, we don't want to be woken up. We want to stay asleep. And so we should not be overly responsive to external stimuli because they might wake us up, unless it's dangerous, in which case we should wake up. But then maybe coming on top of that,
there's this more recent work on memory consolidation that Thomas alluded to that actually shows, well, the brain is processing memories. And in fact, more recently shows if we present stimuli, that can influence the processing of those memories. And I guess that the presentation of those stimuli was just kind of starting to come out, the targeted memory reactivation work where people present stimuli in sleep and that influences consolidation. That was just starting, wasn't it, Anat, when you started your work in this area?
I think maybe the first study was published in 2007 by Björn Rush. And this was like a very exciting work, opening the door to this new field. Several years later, we tackled the question of sleep learning. But yeah, this is indeed was an inspiration of what the brain can do.
I should probably recap what targeted memory reactivation is. So what Björn Rush did is he showed that if you associate odors with learned information and then you represent those odors during sleep, it boosts the consolidation of those memories. And so the brain clearly is processing the odor somehow. And subsequently, people have done the same thing with sounds. And so it sounds like seeing that work actually maybe opened the door for you to start thinking, well, if we can process these stimuli in sleep, then maybe we can learn new information in sleep, which is completely different from just consolidating information that we already had, right?
And it brings the questions, what are the brain mechanisms that enables targeted memory reactivation and the brain mechanism that enable us to learn entirely new information? Are they overlapping to some extent? Why we are able to learn during sleep? Is it just somehow the back door is being left open because the brain needs to process information during sleep for safety and can consolidate and reactivate memories? Maybe because these abilities are important, then simple form of learning are possible because they're using similar brain mechanism. This is hypothesis need to be tested.
Yeah, I agree. But I think there's another question which is sneaking in here, which is about the different stages of sleep, right? So I think you both have looked at learning in sleep in both REM and non-REM states. And yet the targeted memory reactivation literature really has focused pretty much mainly on non-REM. And there's still a big discussion about whether targeted memory reactivation really has any impacts in REM or not. And so the next question would be, well, you had some evidence that stimuli can be processed in non-REM, but what led you to think they might also be processed in REM as well?
I would say maybe it's actually the reverse question that will make most sense, and that I think historically, if you look at the literature on sensory processing or learning during sleep, I think people were started primarily to focus on REM sleep because it's a part of sleep where you dream, so you're already conscious processing information, although it's information coming from within rather than outside. But they're already evident there that you can do complex things and you can remember them. Because even if it's not so frequent, when you wake up, sometimes you can remember your dream. And some dreams can be remembered for years. So the first studies on learning during sleep were actually done in rats during REM sleep. And the same thing with sensory stimulation. There is this notion that if there is somewhere to find this kind of complex cognition, it will be in REM. The problem then is when you study it, you discover that it's actually non-REM. It's often where you see the most of this cognitive processing or learning, which is curious because it's also the part of sleep that is the most essential. So from an initial interest in REM, very often sleep researchers then focus heavily on the non-REM part and forget about the REM part until the third wave of investigation come, and then people say, wait, but there's also the REM, so let's have a look there. So we are really much in this dialectic of focusing on one part of sleep and remembering it's more complex than just that one part, and then focusing on another part. And it's interesting to see how actually these different parts share commonalities. There are both states where you're obviously not processing much of your environment. Your learning abilities are reduced, but the way they achieve that is very likely to be completely different. So it makes it very difficult to understand what could be the function on all of this, if any. But I think one key maybe to understand this is to keep in mind that there are parts of it that might be essential. So if you don't do them, you will just die, and parts of it that are non-essential. And so maybe there are some processes that are really core for the maintenance and the integrity of the neural system. Most likely these processes occur in the deepest part of non-REM sleep, and things that are more things you could do in addition to the rest if you have time. So it's very likely that humans don't need to spend 8 hours in deep non-REM sleep. But still the nights are pretty long. So maybe we have also evolved additional stages of sleep that are less essential, but allow you to do processes that, if they are not essential, could be still beneficial. So you could have this consolidation of memory or rearrangement of memory that you find in some specific sleep stages. Might not be something that you necessarily need to do, but that doesn't mean that it's not interesting to do them.
And I would like to go back to your questions about the different sleep stages. I think it's interesting. It's great to have Thomas here to discuss the differences that we found in our studies about the possibility to learn in REM and non-REM. Because in a way, we use different forms of learning, associative learning or perceptual learning, and we see in a way opposite effects. So when we use associative learning between tones and odors, or between two kinds of odors, we see better performance in non-REM. For example, we found that you can implement the learning within the same night of sleep when you learn the association within non-REM and REM, but you can retrieve it upon awake only if it was presented in non-REM. And when we tested for the aversive conditioning between the odors, we examined how olfactory aversive conditioning between cigarette odor and profoundly unpleasant odor like rotten fish or rotten eggs, whether this learning in sleep could later change behavior. Could it reduce smoking? So what we did was associative learning between a tone and an odor. And we measured the learning by looking at respiration. And I will explain. So when we walk by our favorite bakery and someone just bake a fresh bread, we'll usually take this deep inhale. However, if we walk by a garbage can or public toilet, we usually take a smaller inhale. And this change in nasal respiration, in accordance with the properties of the odor, is our sniff response. And the sniff response happens automatically on a daily basis without us need to be consciously aware. So actually, I can look on the way you breathe and I can read your minds, or at least know if you like or dislike the odor that was presented. And we decided to use the sniff response as our tool for measure learning. So people came to our lab. They didn't know that they are going to hear sound or smell odors during the sleep. And we took one tone and paired it with a pleasant odor of a shampoo, for example, and another tone we paired with a profoundly unpleasant of rotten fish. And we measured the respiration of the sleeping subjects. About a third of the time, we played the tone, but the odor was not presented. So this way we could measure if sleeping people were actually able to learn this association between the tone of the odor. And if indeed they learned, they would now, when they hear the tone that predicts the odor of the rotten fish, they would know that it's better to take a smaller sniff because otherwise it will be an unpleasant experience. And what we discover is that both during non-REM sleep and during REM sleep, people were able to learn this association. So when we played the tone alone, they took a different sniff for a tone that predicted a pleasant odor than for a tone that predicted an unpleasant odor, even though the odor was not there. So this was step one. Okay, people can learn new association during sleep and implement them within the same night of sleep. And then we said, exciting. Can they retrieve this information upon awake? So about half an hour after they woke up, we presented the same tones without odor whatsoever and measured the respiration. And we discovered that again, without knowing, they modulated the respiration in accordance with the properties of the odor that was previously paired actually during sleep only with this tone. And this suggested that people were able to learn entirely new associations during sleep and retrieve them upon awake.
Just to kind of rephrase it and make sure I have it correctly, you paired, they could have been random tones with either pleasant or unpleasant odors, and you saw that people learned to inhale either deeply as if they expected a pleasant odor, or inhale very little as if it was unpleasant. And that was true even when there was no odor there anymore. And it was true during sleep after some exposure, but it was also true the next day. So people had learned kind of the meaning of those tones.
Exactly. And it opened the door to many other questions, right? What other forms of learning can we learn in sleep? We discovered now with Thomas that perceptual learning, for example. How many repetitions do we need to learn in wake in comparison to sleep? How long after that we learn in sleep, we can still retrieve this information? How can sleep learning can influence wake behavior later on? And this triggered our next study, where we wanted to test whether sleep learning can influence wake behavior. So we were looking for a behavior that is easy to quantify and to monitor and is recurrent on a daily basis. And we decided to use smoking. So we asked people who are smoking to fill a smoking diary for 1 week. Then we invited them to our lab and we told them we're going to do something that might help them to reduce smoking or quit. And then we either presented a conditioning between a cigarette odor that I had the pleasure to manufacture in the lab, collecting the buds from the ashtrays in the Weizmann Institute and cook them with propylene glycol, a pleasure. And then we took this odor and paired it with profoundly unpleasant odor. And the conditioning was either in non-REM sleep, in REM sleep, or while they were awake. We had another control groups where the odors were presented, but they were not associated. So they presented in a random order. And then after this one night in the lab, we asked them to fill another smoking diary for 1 week. And we quantified the change in smoking, the change in behavior. And we discovered that after this one session in the lab, there was a significant reduction in smoking if the conditioning was in non-REM sleep. On average, it was of 30%. If the conditioning was in REM, then the reduction in smoking was only 10%.
So let me just ask, so here the conditioning was just smelling this unpleasant odor in the sleeps. Did they have a tone associated with it, or was just smelling the cigarette odor?
Which was paired with profoundly unpleasant odor. So cigarette odor, rotten fish, cigarette odor, rotten eggs. And we made sure that they found it profoundly unpleasant. So we asked them to rank the odor. And if it wasn't unpleasant enough, we increased the intensity. We paid them, so no. So we discovered that the conditioning worked really nicely in REM and non-REM, but there was a dissociation. So the reduction was larger in non-REM and actually even longer lasting in comparison to REM. And interestingly, when we did the same conditioning while they were awake and aware of what we were doing, we found no change in their smoking behavior. So it only worked when it was implicit and in sleep.
So what you're saying is when they learn to associate the cigarette smell with something really unpleasant in non-REM, then they reduce their smoking behavior for a week or two, as long as you followed them. But when you did it in REM, they also reduced it, but just not quite as much.
Yes, we followed them for 1 week. So in REM, it was only 10% of a change and it faded away faster.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And interestingly, Thomas found an opposite effect for perceptual learning.
So, I mean, in both sets of studies, we're talking about perceptual learning, but in your case, it's perceptual associations. And in Thomas's case, it's just a kind of a perceptual recognition, isn't it?
Yes, so indeed, in our study, we could show that in REM sleep, you can learn. And in this case, the learning was perceptual learning of sounds. So when these sounds are presented in REM sleep, we can see that upon awakening, people are better at recognizing them. In non-REM sleep, overall, we have a negative effect. So it was a very surprising thing initially, because it seems that the sounds were unlearned during non-REM. And we had quite a lot of difficulty in the concept itself of unlearning. But this information being presented in non-REM was harder to recognize during wakefulness compared to novel information. But looking into the night itself, since we have a way to track that learning directly by recording the activity of the brain of these people while they sleep, we could see that we have actually this contrast between light and deep non-REM, where in light non-REM, people are able to learn, and in deep non-REM, they were actually suppressing the information they just learned in light non-REM sleep. So maybe the contrast and differences between Anat's study and mine, or other studies on sleep learning, could be interpreted in light with the relative proportion of the different state and how frequently the different stimuli were presented in these different sleep stages. Maybe there are some sleep stages that are more in favor of learning, other that are more in favor of learning and access to this memory during wakefulness. I think it's also important, as Anat was mentioning, to not only acknowledge the richness and diversity of sleep, but also the richness and diversity of memory. And this, it's not because it's learning or memory that we can put everything in the same bag. And between associative learning of others and perceptual learning of sound, it might be completely different, or we actually know it is completely different neural mechanisms at play. And that also could explain some of the differences. For example, in our case, we didn't really collect that information explicitly, but none of the participants were aware, first of all, that they were learning sounds during their sleep, and none of them really recognized these sounds upon awakening. So it's really much of an implicit form of learning.
Would you mind just describing in a little more detail what you actually did in the study?
Yeah, it's actually a quite weird paradigm that consists in learning acoustic noise. So it's a phenomenon that was discovered quite a long time ago by sound engineers when they wanted to play white noise as a background noise. So white noise is the term comes from the analogy with color. So as a white color is just superposition of all colors, white noise is a superposition of all acoustic frequencies. So it's a sound that is no sound. It has really no particular feature. It's pure acoustic noise. And the way you can generate it is just by generating random numbers and feeding that to a sound card, for example, in a computer, and you will obtain white noise. So just the acoustic version of randomness. And since randomness is not very interesting to generate, people were thinking, okay, if I have to play 15 minutes of white noise, I could just generate 30 seconds of white noise and loop that for 15 minutes, and people won't notice because it's just noise. What they found out is actually people are really good at noticing it. So even if something is very, very random, as soon as it has some regularities, the brain will pick that up because our brains are master at picking regularities in the environment, even when these regularities are pure noise. So this paradigm of so-called white noise learning was designed by Daniel Presnizer, who is an acoustic neuroscientist in Paris, who studied that phenomenon in wake and found out that this form of learning is effortless. You don't need to pay attention. It's really something automatic, as if we were hijacking this ability of the brain to pick up regularities in the environment. So we thought that's the ideal case to use during sleep, because if it's effortless and people can do it even without paying attention, they should be able to do it while they sleep. And that's why we play this same kind of sound. So what we used was snippets of half a second of white noise that we were putting one after the other. And initially, it just sounds like nothing. So it's a type of shh like this. But repetition after repetition, you start hearing a pattern, and there is a rhythm that starts coming. Every half a second, you have the impression that something is coming back. And you can start hallucinate very peculiar sounds. So some people say they are hearing birds. Other thinks it's the pipes in the building that are making weird noises. So it's very idiosyncratic. Everyone is hearing something different, but you start hearing something after a while. So what we did was to present this sound during sleep and to check whether the brain was reacting. So whether we were seeing this rhythm in the brain of noticing something. And then when they were waking up, we were presenting the same sound that they heard during sleep along new ones, and we were measuring how quick they were at picking up the regularity. And what we see that the sound that were presented in REM sleep are picked up quicker, but the sounds presented in non-REM sleep are picked up after new sounds. So they are more difficult to recognize, hinting with this notion of suppression during the deepest part of non-REM sleep. So obviously it's a very, very peculiar form of learning because it's not a form of learning that will be useful in any situation during your waking life. At no point it is interesting to learn noise. But it's evidencing that the mechanism enabling learning are still present and functional in certain parts of sleep. So we use the sound that was ideal for sleep because it will not wake up people. They couldn't care less, basically. But it means that if the machinery for learning is in place, then we can use other sounds to have potentially more interesting or more relevant form of learning.
So you said that they learn more quickly in REM sleep and more slowly in non-REM, but didn't you also find quite a difference between light non-REM, so stage 2, and deeper non-REM, so slow wave? I think they also learn in the light non-REM.
Yeah, exactly. So since it's a form of learning that's gradual, so contrary to association where you can learn an association in one shot, with perceptual learning, it's something gradual that you will learn little by little. And with these indexes of learning in brain activity, we can actually track the evolution of this learning. So what we could see that in REM sleep, we have a gradual learning. But in non-REM sleep, we had actually this quite peculiar dynamic where first they start learning the item. As long as they are in the light parts of non-REM, they will learn these sounds. And then when they transit toward deep non-REM sleep, you see the sound being actually forgotten. So you can see this index of learning that is going back to 0. And since you have this quite stereotypical sequence. Within the night, you have these cycles that always start with light non-REM, then deep non-REM, then REM, light non-REM, deep non-REM, and REM. We had like this several times during the night, episodes where they were learning, then forgetting. Then in REM, we were presenting other sounds. Then again, light non-REM, they were learning, forgetting, and so on. And since the deep non-REM comes after the light non-REM, usually, what we saw when they were waking up is no learning at all because the learning they were able to do had been erased.
What's your explanation for that? Or do you have one? Why do you think the stages differ so much? And why do you think the deep non-REM actually erased the learning?
So we have a hypothesis about a change that could be explained with neuromodulation. So we know that in deep non-REM sleep, a key neuromodulator for learning, which is acetylcholine, is being suppressed. And that's not the case in REM sleep. And it's unclear in light non-REM sleep, but you can imagine that light non-REM sleep between waking and non-REM, that this level of acetylcholine would be at an intermediary level in light non-REM. So we were in a situation where in the stages where we were evidencing learning, which was wake, light non-REM, and REM, it's all stages where acetylcholine is not suppressed. So there are differences, obviously, but there is a bit of production and secretion of acetylcholine. While in deep non-REM, acetylcholine is at its lowest level. And there has been studies in animals showing that if you lower the level of acetylcholine, you can reverse the plasticity rule within the brain. So when acetylcholine is high, you have this so-called law of neurons firing together, bind together. Whereas when acetylcholine is low, you have the reverse happening. So what's likely to happen when you're awake and you learn these sounds is that these sounds are eliciting our activity networks of neurons that become stronger and stronger. because even if it's noise, it will still be always the same noise. So it will little by little activate a more and more coherent network of neurons. And if your level of acetylcholine is high, this network is being potentiated, getting stronger, and that's how you build the memory for that particular noise snippet. Now, what we think is happening in deep non-REM sleep is that the same thing happens. So the noise is still activating the network of neurons, but because acetylcholine is low, the effect of activation is actually to loosen strength of the network and little by little to disintegrate it. And that's how you will be able to unlearn. So the fact that had happened when you hear sounds is a bit of an accident, I will say. I don't think it has an interest at all to forget what you are hearing during that part of sleep. It actually might be just the expression of a phenomenon that naturally occurs during the deepest part of sleep, which is that this change in neuromodulation could allow your brain to clean up the useless synaptic connection between neurons. And this is something that has been proposed by Giulio Tononi and Chiara Cirelli, so two eminent sleep researchers with whom I've had the chance to work. And they actually propose that hypothesis that the deepest part of non-REM sleep is useful to clean redundant or useless connections within the brain. And what we think is happening is actually this process at work of disintegrating networks of neurons that are storing our memories.
So those deep parts of non-REM sleep are also, so we're talking about slow wave sleep, and it's also the time that is the most strongly associated with memory consolidation, which would seem, I mean, on the surface, it would seem that these two things are in opposition, but maybe you can talk a bit about how you would reconcile the unlearning of your kind of perceptual learning with the strengthening of things like word pairs and associations.
I think here the prime is mostly a semantic. So in sleep, we usually look at the data, and there is this convention of looking at windows of 30 seconds. And depending on the kind of activity we have in this window, we'll say that people are in light non-REM and deep non-REM. But it's very likely that from the brain perspective, that's not really the time windows that matters. And I think what will be much more pertinent would be to look at the kind of pattern of activity that you have on much shorter time frame. And we have this notion already in the sleep literature of different types of slow wave. So you have the trains of slow wave, or you have isolated slow wave. There are also evidence that you can actually divide these slow waves into two groups, where you have slow waves that are more global, so that will really synchronize large areas of the brain, and slow waves that are more local and that are generated in small ensembles of neurons. My intuition, but this needs to be proven, obviously, is that when you have global events, you are in a situation where you can do this memory consolidation, because then you're putting different structure in contact, and they can dialogue and exchange information and potentially do this transfer of information that is supposed to occur during memory consolidation during sleep. Whereas local slow waves will potentially have a role more of cleaning the system for these useless or redundant connections. As it happens, it's probable that global events tend to occur mostly in light non-REM and local events mostly in deep non-REM, but it doesn't need to be so clear-cut. So it's possible that sometimes in deep non-REM, you still have global events that will be able to consolidate memories. And that could be especially the case when we receive external information, because these global events have been shown to be associated with external events. So if you present an information to people, even during their deep sleep, if that information is relevant or important, it's likely to trigger global events and therefore potentially memory consolidation. Well, if you're not presenting an external information, or if in our case we're presenting information that is as non-pertinent as just pure noise, it's possible that then what you will keep is more local phenomenon. And therefore you are more in a situation where you will have this forgetting.
Maybe there is something also fundamentally different between information that was previously learned during wake and information that is presented for the first time during sleep. Maybe the information that was presented during wake is protected in some way from the processes of forgetting during slow wave, because it was already established for a bit. So this is another hypothesis that could explain this dissociation.
It's actually in one of the recent review on this hypothesis about synaptic downscaling during sleep. They discuss this possibility of tagging some memories for preservation. So the tag is a bit unclear. In their framework, it will be a molecular tag even. So synapses will be tagged with specific molecules for preservation. You have the work of Sophie Schwartz in Switzerland, which have a more high-level notion of this tag, where motivation this time, or even emotion, could actually be this tag that will flag a memory for conservation. So here I think it's very important to indeed always factor in that behind this notion of sleep learning, if you use radically different learning situation or type of stimuli, it's not so surprising that you might have completely different outcomes.
And I think that in that review article, which you mentioned about the tagging, Cirelli and Tononi also suggest that it could be the reactivation of the memories, which sort of allows the tagging. So it might be that emotional things are tagged during wake and they will just be preserved, or it might be that once something reactivates or is reinstated during that non-REM phase, then it has a tag that says don't downscale this, or it's protected from downscaling during the time of the reactivation, or somehow it doesn't downscale as much. But so now let's go back to this question of thinking about the difference in the results with respect to REM and non-REM sleep and why that might relate to the tasks, the difference between the association task and the recognition task.
Yeah, I think the nature of the two stimuli and the two types of learning could explain that difference. So in Anat's case, we're talking about something that's unpleasant. So something that you wouldn't be able to ignore if you're awake. So something that likely will have a quite strong effect on the individual and on its brain activity. Potentially something that will elicit stronger and global responses within the brain. And that type of activation of the brain might be interpreted as a form of local awakening within sleep, or where you will recover potentially some wake-like abilities, like being able to associate two elements with one another. In the case of the study I conducted, the stimuli is perhaps the opposite that you would imagine. So it has no meaning at all. It's nondescript. You wouldn't pay attention to it in your environment. It's the least informative stimulus you might encounter, just pure noise. We use it as background or as a way to muffle other sounds. So it's really nothing interesting. But you can still learn it, potentially locally. So maybe the biggest contrast here is how these stimuli are going to impact the brain. In the case of this acoustic noise, potentially the parts of the brain, like the auditory cortex, might still be sensitive, receiving that information and being able to learn it locally. But that form of learning might be enough so that we can see positive or negative effects upon awakening. In the case of Anat, maybe the orchestra of brain region that you elicit with each of this presentation of a nasty odor might be much larger. So you're recruiting things, more global networks. And that more global activation might enforce a learning that is itself more important or easier to see upon awakening, so much that it will actually attenuate some of your bad habits.
And another possible explanation or another difference is the dynamics of the learning. Aversive conditioning could be learned very quickly. After 1 or 2 repetitions with really profoundly unpleasant odor, you learn, you avoid. And I'm not sure how long does it take to learn the sequence of the white noise, but I guess it is longer. Do you have an estimation, Thomas, of how long it takes participants to learn, even in wake?
It depends on the parameters of the sound. So the shorter the noise snippet, the harder it is to pick up that something is repeating. And it depends on the nature of the sound. And we call it an idiosyncratic learning, because for one noise snippet, one individual could learn that in 2-3 repetitions. And for someone else, they will never learn it, no matter how many repetitions you give. So there is a lot of idiosyncrasies, not only in what people hear or how they perceive these sounds, but also in their ability to learn them. But typically with parameters we set, you need quite a few repetition. And the reason why it's not one shot is because we selected this information to be as least interesting as possible. So the idea for us was really to try not to wake up people in any way. Where the nasty order, I think, is if they are not fully waking up, part of the brain might be waking up or processing this information as there is something special going on here.
I agree that it will be fascinating to look at the local dynamics during these processes of learning and see if there is indeed local islands of awakening. Maybe what is unique about olfaction is that the odors could be processed deeply even without waking you up, because you have this bypass of the thalamus. So these are two possible explanations that could be tested.
Odors are very special in their own right. So acoustic noise is certainly special, but odors as well. Whether aversive learning will be possible with other means, like purely auditory or tactile. There are some evidence in paradoxical or REM sleep that you can do conditioning in rats with painful stimuli, but I'm not aware of any similar study in humans.
And so just kind of thinking back on what you've both hypothesized here, it sounds like we think the difference between non-REM and REM here, it could be something to do with the concentrations of acetylcholine, which influence plasticity. It could be something to do with downscaling that happens in deep non-REM. And it could be just that there are differences in the kinds of learning that we're looking at and the way the brain processes them. And so these are all factors that we need to consider, basically.
And maybe one other factor that might be even simpler, but sometimes overlooked, and maybe, Anat, you can provide more details here, but I'm not sure if you equalize the number of presentation in non-REM and REM, but typically since we do much less REM sleep than non-REM sleep, you might be in a situation where people received more often the information in non-REM versus REM. So effects can also differ because you have these differences in duration. You have also differences with the timing of the awakening. So we tend to have ends of night that are richer in REM sleep. So this time, potentially you will have the reverse effect. What's presented in REM is fresher in people's memory rather than what's presented in non-REM. A lot of studies as well, comparing non-REM and REM, will use the beginning of the night for non-REM and the end of the night for REM. So then you have this circadian effect going into play. So it's really the answer to explain these differences might be very multifactorial. And the paucity of studies investigating this is making it very, very difficult to have definite answers because there are so many variables and so little studies. We're really much at the state of making conjectures.
I very much agree. In our case, we used similar amount of repetitions, but you cannot fully control for the timing because REM is usually closer to the morning awakening. And what we need now is more researchers joining the effort in order to really understand what can and actually what cannot be learned during sleep and when and how.
What cannot, I think, is very, very important because we tend to focus on the studies that showed learning during sleep. And we tend to forget about the heroes that actually could not find anything. And remember, when I started my PhD, so my PhD supervisor really wanted me to focus on learning. And at some point, we found a PhD thesis. The name escaped me, unfortunately. But it was an entire PhD thesis on sleep and learning, and it was a series of negative results. So very smart experiments, but all leading to no results. So much that I brought the thesis to Sid and I told him, you see, it's just impossible to learn during sleep. This is hopeless. Let's change topic. But he was insistent and he was right to be insistent. But there are other more recent examples of people who failed to show things that can be perfectly learned during wake that are not learned during sleep. And it seems to be that as soon as the learning is a bit more complex, so it needs integrating information about larger temporal scales or need to be explicit, then you can't evidence it during sleep. So with sleep learning, we might be, or maybe just we have not found the way to do this kind of learning. But with the techniques we have so far, it seems that we can target the easiest or simplest or more nuclear forms of learning.
Yeah, I very much agree. And also the timing, right? There is the work of Mark Zutz from Katharina Henke Group, where they found that it's really important when you present the stimuli. So they used verbal associative learning, and they find it's crucial when you present the words in relation to the slow wave, for example. So step by step, we are learning when you can learn in a way.
Yes, and in Mark's work, I think it was a kind of a semantic learning, wasn't it? So they learned non-words were paired with real words, and then later they presented the non-words and they asked, would this fit in a shoebox or not? So this is the kind of conceptual associative learning that they did. And that's right. I think they found that only the words which were presented on the tops of slow oscillations where there was little theta activity, these were the ones that were learned. So they argued that there are particular conditions which are appropriate for learning even in this non-REM sleep. That just makes things more complicated, doesn't it?
It's not necessarily making things more complicated. So the finding you just mentioned was recently replicated by Mathieu Corona, who just graduated last week from his PhD in Sid Quitter's team. So with a slightly different paradigm, they replicated this semantic association learning that is specific of a certain window. So it's not published yet, but hopefully will be very soon. And interestingly, it's known in the rodent literature that in the same part of the slow wave, just before this is usually when you see activation in the locus coeruleus. And the locus coeruleus produces noradrenaline, which is also one of these neuromodulators that is very important to pay attention to the external world and learn specific items or potentiates memory. So you could be in a situation where within sleep, you have windows like this, critical time windows of wake-like, or where you recover some of the characteristic. I'm not saying that it is wake within sleep, but some of the characteristic of wakefulness can be recovered in very, very short window, but very specific window within non-REM. So if you're lucky enough that you're able to target these windows, then you might potential learning. And that's why we had this great success of targeted memory reactivation, because external stimuli are known actually to create these windows in which you will elicit a slow wave that will potentially then create a window where things can be reactivated and consolidated. So all of this could actually very much make sense if we change a bit all time windows, and instead of looking at sleep from a very global perspective, we actually focus on timescale that might be more relevant for the activity of the brain, which is likely to be sub-second and potentially even at the millisecond level. So if we can finally target these moments, we might actually find much more abilities to learn than what can be evidenced by bombarding the brain randomly with information.
We also have some data that support this way of thinking. Like several other labs, I think there are several unpublished sets of data showing that if you trigger reactivation on the peaks and the troughs of slow oscillations, you get differential effects. And in our case, what we find is it's kind of a complex high-level association task. In the peaks, it helps people to make the associations. And in the troughs, it wipes the associations that were made already. So this is again suggesting that you have to be very careful about where you target things, at least within deep non-REM sleep. So it's a complicated picture, but nevertheless, you guys and Mark Zust, and it sounds like some of these early authors from the 60s have collectively convinced the world. You've given strong evidence that the brain can learn during sleep. What do you think are the next big questions and experiments to do? What should we be looking at to push this forward?
I think what we have shown actually is that although in a very specific situation, we can show that people can learn during sleep, they're actually very bad at it and shouldn't do that because the effects are very, very small. And when you talk with people that are either out of the field or out of academic research in general, they get very excited about this idea of learning sleep. And the first thing they ask, and maybe my accent might be prompting this very specific question, but I'm often asked whether they can learn French while they sleep. Obviously, they can't. And the one advice I give them is to reserve their learning for wakefulness and just have a good night's sleep. Because the thing we might forget when we talk about this experiment, it's likely come at a price. I mean, the participants we test are not necessarily super fresh and super happy when the morning comes, because we're perturbing their sleep. And we're likely perturbing a very wide array of important processes by forcing them to learn something in a state where it's very likely that their brain is not really good at it. So if anything, yes, we can learn during sleep, but not very well. There's one exception to this that I think Anat remarkably showed in her work, is that even if learning during sleep might be very difficult and might just represent a very tiny forms of learning, it seemed that in what she showed, there could be some interesting use of this, because in certain circumstances, you might have a different form of learning than when you're awake. The fact that in her study with conditioning with the smokers, the fact that the same manipulation is not working when they're awake is very interesting. The way I interpret it is that when we're awake, we're not that stupid. So if you smoke near a trash, and nowadays smokers have to do that a lot because they're not allowed to smoke in buildings anymore. If you do that, I mean, you can make clearly a dissociation between the odor of all the act of smoking and that nasty odor that you have near you, because we know that it's coincidental that we have the two things at the same time. And that might be why they are not being conditioned while they're awake. When they're asleep, maybe their brain is a bit more stupid, and we'll make that association even if it doesn't make sense. So we might have within sleep a window to trick the brain into thinking something that we wouldn't think or will not associate while being awake. Then it becomes quite interesting to use this kind of learning to help people correct some of the biases they will prefer not to have. So it could be an habit. It could be biases that we have in our social interactions. There's this work of Ken Baller on reducing racial bias during sleep. There is some labs, so the lab of Akwan Low, who is a consciousness researcher, is trying to devise a way to reduce phobia. And so far, they're using subliminal images to do this. But you can imagine that sleep could be actually a perfect time window to do this kind of thing. So to reactivate memories that can be traumatic, try to associate it with positive association and see whether that could reduce your phobia during the day. In a situation where you're not really aware of what's going on, and you will believe this association kind of automatically because you're losing your control or your rationality. So all this aspect of sleep learning that are playing on the implicit nature of the learning, instead of being a limitation, could potentially actually become a strength.
I very much agree that if I have to choose, I would prefer to learn during wake and sleep during sleep. I think it is fascinating to understand what are the capabilities of the unconscious brain at the cognitive level and at the basic science level to understand how this machinery works, and also see if it could bring some beneficial effects as implicit learning that could sometimes have stronger effects than explicit learning.
I think that's probably the answer to what I was going to ask you, which is why should the learning during sleep be more effective in this way for these implicit biases and things like cigarette smoking? Do you think it's because it's implicit and somehow deeper?
As a scientist, I have to say that in the study we conducted, we cannot disentangle the fact that the implicit learning was in sleep and the explicit learning was in wake. So in order to fully answer this, we have to do another experiment, which will be implicit in wake, explicit in wake as well. To do explicit in sleep, it's also a possibility to tell them what we are going to do in advance and then present it. Then I could have the full answer. Is it a combination of being implicit and being sleep, make it even stronger than just being implicit in wake? These are open questions that need to be answered scientifically.
Wonderful. Well, I mean, this has been so interesting. For me, it's just scratching the surface. I feel like I could talk to you guys for hours. Thank you very much. And best of luck with your future research.
Thank you. I very much enjoyed the conversation. It was great talking with both of you about what I found so fascinating.
It's wonderful that you organize this, and the topic is fantastic in itself. But being there with you and talking with Anat, For me, it's a great privilege.
You've been listening to the Sleep Science Podcast with me, Penny Lewis. My guests today were Anat Arzi of ICM Paris and Thomas Andrillon of Monash University, Melbourne. Our producer was Eniko Simo. If you've enjoyed the show, please consider subscribing to the podcast or liking us on Twitter. If you have questions or comments, please get in touch via Sleep Science Podcast, all one word, @gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and until next time, sleep well.